You need to keep this mask on. Breathe slowly for me. We're almost there. Just hold still.
Have you ever done something so selfless that people called you a hero and smiled to yourself because they had absolutely no idea? I took 3 bullets for a man I had never met in my life. 3. And when the ambulance came, when the cameras flashed, when strangers held my hand and cried for me, I didn't feel pain. I felt something far more dangerous than pain. I felt satisfaction. See, the world has a funny way of crowning the wrong people heroes. They looked at me bleeding on that pavement and saw sacrifice. They saw courage. They saw a woman who risked everything for a stranger.
Live at the scene where Amanda, a local woman, heroically saved lives by standing in front of 3 bullets.
But what they didn't see was the 12 years I spent planning that exact moment. 12 years of silence. 12 years of watching. 12 years of becoming someone so invisible, so unthreatening, so easy to look past that when the moment finally came. Nobody questioned it. Not one person. He ordered that shot. That powerful, untouchable man who has never once answered for anything he has ever done in his life, he gave that order without even blinking. But what he didn't know is that I needed him to. Because a man who feels no guilt is a man who stays guarded. But a man who watches an innocent woman take bullets because of his order, that man starts to crack. And a cracked man is a reachable man. My name is not important right now. What's important is that he's sitting somewhere tonight, losing his mind over a woman he thinks he almost killed. He has no idea he's already looking at his end. But I need you to stop for just 1 second. Because what I'm about to tell you next changes everything you think you know about me. Everything. And I need to know who is actually here for this. Who is genuinely locked in right now. Because the people who leave halfway never find out what I actually did. And trust me, you do not want to be that person tonight. So before we go further, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment right now telling me where in the world you're watching this from. I want to see you in those comments. I want to know who was here the night this story made their jaw drop. Because it's coming. The twist? The moment I've been building toward for 12 years? It's closer than you think. Now buckle up, because I'm just getting started. I want to tell you something that nobody tells you about grief. They tell you it gets better. They tell you time heals. They tell you that one day you wake up and the weight of it is lighter and you can finally breathe again. Nobody tells you that some grief doesn't get lighter. Some grief just gets quieter. It learns to live inside you like a tenant that pays no rent and never leaves. And you learn if you are smart, if you are patient, to make that grief work for you instead of against you. That is what I did. Soul doesn't care about your pain. That is actually what I love about it. 14 million people moving, breathing, living, and not one of them is looking at you. Not one of them knows what you are carrying. In a city that big, a grieving woman is just a woman. And a woman with a plan is just a woman with somewhere to be. I came here with 3 things. A name, a photograph, and a wound that had been bleeding quietly inside me for so long that I had stopped noticing the blood. My name is Amara. And before I tell you what I did, I need to tell you who I lost. Because none of this makes sense without him. Nothing in my life has made sense without him. His name was Kofi. And I need you to understand something before I go any further. I need you to understand that Kofi was not just my brother. Kofi was the person who made me feel like existing was worth the trouble. Like being alive had texture and color and reason. He was that person for me. The one person. Do you have someone like that? Someone whose presence in your life made everything feel more real if you do hold on to them. Hold on to them so tightly. Because I am telling you from the other side of losing mine that nothing prepares you for the silence they leave behind. Nothing. Kofi was 23 years old when he died. He laughed with his whole body. Not a polite laugh. A full body, room-filling, strangers turning around laugh that was embarrassing sometimes when we were in quiet places and magnificent everywhere else. He smelled like coconut oil and old books. He used to say that books were just people who had figured something out and wanted to tell you about it, and he wanted to hear from all of them. He called me his shadow. Because from the time I was small, I followed him everywhere. Everywhere he went, I was behind him. 2 steps back, watching, learning, absorbing everything he was. He never told me to go away. Not once. He would look back over his shoulder, see me there, and just smile, like my presence was the most natural thing in the world. I would give everything I have to be 2 steps behind him again. Everything. The last conversation we ever had was on a Tuesday. He called me from Seoul. He had been there 2 years on a scholarship, studying literature, becoming the person he had always been trying to become. I was still home. I was 17. He called and asked how I was doing, and I told him I was fine, and he said, "You don't sound fine," and I said I was just tired, and he said, "Amara, I know you, talk to me." But I didn't. I told him it was nothing. I told him I'd call him back later. I never called him back. 2 days later, he was gone. I have replayed that Tuesday phone call in my head every single day for 12 years. Every single day. If I had just talked to him, if I had just kept him on the phone a little longer, if I had just... But that is the thing about the calls we don't make and the words we don't say. They don't disappear, they just become the weight you carry forever. I carried mine all the way to Seoul, and I kept one thing of his with me the entire time. A bracelet. Simple. Braided leather and a small metal clasp. He had bought it from a market vendor when he first arrived in Seoul, because he said it reminded him of home. He wore it every single. The police gave it to me along with the other items from his pockets when I came to identify him. I have worn it on my left wrist every day since. Every single day. Through everything. Through all 12 years of everything. I was wearing it the night I took 3 bullets. I was wearing it the night I walked into Park Jae-won's house for the last time. It was the last thing I looked at before I pulled the trigger. I need to take you to October. A Wednesday night. Kofi had gone out to meet a friend. He texted me at 7 p.m. just 3 words. Going out tonight. That was Kofi. 3 words where anyone else would use 30. He was economy of language in a body that was pure excess of joy. Those 3 words are the last thing he ever sent me. I was in our small apartment in Itaewon doing the dishes when I felt it. I don't know how else to explain it except to say that I felt it. A shift. Like something in the air changed. Like the apartment suddenly had too much space in it. Like his absence, which should have been temporary, ordinary. The normal absence of a brother gone out for the evening felt different from all the other absences. Heavier. Final. I told myself I was being dramatic. I finished the dishes. I watched television. I checked my phone. Midnight came. No Kofi. I called him. No answer. 1 a.m. No Kofi. I called again. And again. And again. 7 times between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m. 7 times that phone rang out into whatever silence had swallowed him and came back to me with nothing. I was sitting on the floor by the front door when the police knocked. I don't know when I moved there, I just remember being on the floor. Like my body knew before my mind did, and had lowered itself to the ground to receive what was coming. 2 officers. Careful faces. The kind of careful that is not kindness but is trying to look like it. They said, "Incident." They said, "Crossfire." They said, "I'm so sorry." I remember asking them, and my voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, someone very far away. I asked them if he had been alone, if anyone had been with him, if he had been scared. They didn't know, or they did know and couldn't tell me. Either way, the answer was the same. Nothing. Just a door closing on every question I would spend the rest of my life asking. I sat on that floor for a long time after they left. I don't know how long. Time stopped working properly that night, and it took years before it fully started again. I kept thinking he is going to walk through that door. He is going to come in laughing about something. That whole body laugh, and I am going to be so relieved that I am going to be furious with him, and he is going to hug me until the fury becomes something else. He did not walk through that door. He never walked through any door again. And somewhere in that night, in that apartment, on that floor, the 17-year-old girl who had followed her brother like a shadow became someone else entirely. Became me. 3 days after the funeral, which I arranged alone. At 17, in a country whose language I barely spoke. for a brother who deserved so much better than what I could give him. An old man grabbed my arm. A street vendor. He sold hotdog on the corner near where it happened. He had seen everything. I could tell by the way he looked at me that he had been watching for me, waiting for the right moment, terrified of his own courage. He leaned close. He whispered a name like it was something cursed, like the syllables themselves could bring consequences. Park Jae-won. Then he walked away fast and never looked at me again. I stood on that corner in the October cold with that name burning in my chest like a coal. Park Jae-won. 2 words. 4 syllables. The entire explanation for every unanswered question. For the officers with their careful faces. For the 7 phone calls that rang out into silence. For the floor. For all of it. I went home. I wrote the name down. I looked at it for a long time. And then I wrote something underneath it. He will know Kofi's name. Even if it takes everything I have. Even if it takes the rest of my life. He will say my brother's name and he will mean it. I folded that piece of paper and put it in my pocket. I kept it there for 12 years. The paper fell apart eventually. The words stayed. If you live in Seoul and move in the wrong circles, you know the name Park Jae-won. On the surface, businessman, real estate, import and export, charity galas and photographs with politicians. The kind of man whose hands look clean because he has paid other people to do the washing for 30 years. Underneath that surface, one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations in South Korea. Territory, contracts, people in police precincts and government offices. 30 years of operations and not one successful prosecution. Not one. And Kofi, my laughing, book-loving brother, had been in the wrong place at the wrong minute. He had witnessed something. He had seen something Park Jae-won did not want seen. And so Park Jae-won did what Park Jae-won does. He gave an order. 10 seconds. Maybe less. That is all it took. 10 seconds and a decision, and my brother, a whole entire human being. A person with a laugh that filled rooms and a voice that could talk to you about Toni Morrison for 2 hours and a smile that made strangers feel welcome, was reduced to a loose end. A loose end. My brother. A loose end. And here's what broke something permanently open in me. He forgot. Park Jae-won woke up the morning after Kofi died and ate his breakfast and moved through his day without a single thought of what he had done. Kofi was not even a memory to him. He was just a problem that had been solved. Filed away and forgotten before the blood had even dried on that Itaewon street. I was 17 years old. And I understood something in that moment that I have never been able to unfeel since. The most unbearable thing is not that someone took everything from you. The most unbearable thing is that they didn't even think it was worth remembering. That was the wound that never closed. And that was the wound that drove everything that came next. I went home. I finished school. I studied Korean until I dreamed in it. I read everything I could find about Park Jae-won until I knew him the way you only know someone. You have been obsessively, relentlessly, quietly studying for years. And here is what nobody tells you about living for revenge. It is lonely, profoundly, completely, achingly lonely, because you cannot let anyone fully in. Every friendship has a ceiling. Every relationship has a limit. You smile, and you show up, and you seem like a person who is present, and underneath it you are somewhere else entirely. You are in an Itaewon street in October. You are on a floor waiting for a door to open. You are always, always, always there. There were nights in those 12 years when I sat alone in my apartment and held Kofi's bracelet and talked to him, out loud, like he could hear me. I told him what I was doing. I told him why. I asked him if he understood. I asked him if he was angry with me. I asked him if he was at peace somewhere, and if he knew that I was not, that I would not be not yet. I don't know if he heard me. I talked to him anyway. I came back to Seoul when I was 24. I built a life so ordinary and invisible that no one would look twice. I worked as a translator. I rented a small apartment in Mapogu. I smiled at neighbors. I went to markets. I looked to everyone who knew me, like a young woman who had simply found a city she loved. I was the most dangerous person in every room I entered. And nobody knew it. Not even on the hard nights. Not even on the nights when the plan felt like madness and the grief felt like concrete, and I sat by my window watching the rain fall on Seoul and wondered whether Kofi would even recognize who I had become. Those nights were the hardest. When I wondered if I had turned into something my brother would not understand. Whether the girl he called his shadow had become someone who lived so deep in darkness that even he couldn't find her anymore. On those nights I touched the bracelet. I remembered his laugh. I remembered Tuesday. I remembered, "You don't sound fine, Amara, talk to me." And I kept going. 3 years before the night of the bullets, I found Junho. He was 20 years old. Quiet. Serious. The kind of young man who carries something heavy behind his eyes that he has never fully learned to put down, and I recognized that immediately because I had been carrying the same thing since I was 17. His mother had been killed by Park Jae-won's organization 8 years earlier. A different story, a different order, the same ruthless signature. I had known about Junho for months before I introduced myself. I had watched him. I am not proud of that, but I am honest about it. I watched him the way I watched everything connected to Park Jae-won. Carefully, with purpose. But then something happened that I had not anticipated. I actually got to know him, not the version of him I needed for my plan. Him, Junho, the young man who ate alone most evenings at a small pojang maca because he said the noise of other people eating made him feel less alone without the obligation of conversation. The young man who had his mother's hands, he told me this once, quietly, looking at his own palms like they were something borrowed. The young man who laughed differently than Kofi, smaller, more reluctant, but who laughed in a way that made you feel like you had earned something when you caused it. I liked him, genuinely. And in 12 years of walls and ceilings and strategic friendships, genuinely liking someone felt so unfamiliar that it scared me. I told him I had also lost someone. I told him I understood the particular weight of unanswered questions. And in that shared understanding, something real grew, the kind of bond that only forms between people who have survived the same wound inflicted by the same kind of careless cruelty. But here is what I never told him. I never told him that I had chosen him. That of all the people Park Jae-won had broken, Junho was the one I needed because Junho had recently started asking questions, quiet questions, the kind that get noticed in the wrong circles. I had intercepted enough whispers to know that Park Jae-won had noticed, which meant an order was coming, and I was going to be there when it did. I told myself this was strategy. I told myself Junho was a piece of the plan. But somewhere in those 3 years of pojangmaka evenings and quiet conversations and watching him look at his mother's hands, I stopped being entirely sure that was true. He was real to me. That was the complication I had not budgeted for. The signal came on a Thursday in November. 2 words from a source I had spent 2 years cultivating. "Tonight, Junho." I had been preparing for this moment for 8 months. I knew the routes. I knew the timing. I had run the calculations so many times, they were less like a plan and more like a fact, something that was simply going to happen. But standing in my apartment that evening, getting dressed, checking the bracelet on my wrist, I felt something I had not expected to feel. Fear. Not for myself. For Junho. For what I was about to put him through. He was going to watch a woman take bullets beside him and he was going to believe it was random and he was going to carry that for the rest of his life. And I had made that choice for him without his knowledge and without his consent. I stood in my bathroom for a long time looking at myself in the mirror. I touched Kofi's bracelet. I thought about Tuesday. About, "You don't sound fine, Amara. Talk to me." And I walked out the door. I intercepted Junho on his walk home. We fell into step together naturally, 2 friends heading the same direction. He was telling me about a film he had seen. I was half listening. My entire body was tuned to everything else. The street, the shadows, the particular quality of silence that descends on a city block a half second before something violent breaks it. I heard the footsteps, and I moved. 3 shots. The pain was extraordinary. There is no level of preparation that makes a bullet anything other than what it is. I went down hard on wet pavement, and the cold came up through my jacket instantly, and Junho was screaming above me, and the city kept moving around us the way cities do in different, relentless, 14 million heartbeats that were not mine. And through all of it, I want to be honest with you. Because I have been honest about everything else through all of it. I was not thinking about the plan. I was not thinking about Park Jae-won. I was thinking about Kofi. I was thinking, I hope this was worth it. I hope you can see this. I hope you understand what I am doing and why. I hope you still recognize me. The last thing I saw clearly before the darkness came was the bracelet on my wrist, soaked in rain and blood. Still there. I was not there when Park Jae-won heard the news. But I know what happened. Because I have studied this man for 12 years, and because what happened next was exactly what I had predicted, and also, in one way, more than I had predicted. Park Jae-won went still when he heard. His people said they had never seen him like that. This was not a man who typically permitted himself to feel the human cost of his decisions. He had walls. Decades of carefully constructed, rigorously maintained walls. But walls have cracks. And an innocent woman, a young foreign woman, a civilian bleeding on a sole street because of his order found one. He had a daughter once. She had died young. She had been around my age. And something about the image, my face in the news, the story, the senseless wrongness of it reached him in a place he thought was permanently sealed. He arranged anonymously for my hospital bills to be paid in full. That was the first crack. I had planned for a crack. What I had not fully planned for was lying in a hospital bed for 6 weeks with 3 bullet wounds and too much time to think, and finding that the thinking was not always about the plan. Sometimes the thinking was just grief. Pure, old, unresolved grief. That the adrenaline and the purpose and the 12 years of forward motion had been holding at bay, and that now, with my body forced into stillness, came flooding back with a force I was not prepared for. I cried in that hospital. At night, alone, when the ward was quiet. I cried for Kofi in a way I had not allowed myself to cry since I was 17 on that floor. I cried for the Tuesday phone call, for the dishes I was doing when he died, for the 7 calls that rang out, for his laugh, for his books, for the way he would have hated what I had become, or maybe understood it in that way he always understood me, even when I couldn't explain myself. Junho visited every day. Every day he came and sat beside my bed and held my hand and apologized. And every day I told him he had nothing to apologize for. And every day that felt like the heaviest lie I'd ever told. I was discharged 6 weeks later. The night I came home to my apartment, the same small apartment in Mapogu, everything exactly where I had left it, I sat down on my bed and I did not move for a very long time. I looked around at 12 years of accumulated purpose. The notes, the maps, the years of patience condensed into this moment of arrival. I was closer to Park Jae-won than I had ever been. The plan was working. Everything was in motion. And I felt nothing, just empty. Just a woman sitting on a bed in a city that wasn't her home, with 3 healing bullet wounds and a dead brother's bracelet on her wrist, wondering for the first time in 12 years whether any of this was going to give her back what she had lost. Because here is the thing about revenge that nobody who has never lived inside it can tell you. At some point, usually at the worst possible moment, usually when you are most alone, you realize that even if it works, even if you get everything you planned for, the person you are doing it for is still gone. Kofi is still gone. No amount of Park Jae-won's guilt or pain or paralysis brings my brother back through that door. I sat with that for a long time. And then I picked up the bracelet and I held it in both hands, and I said out loud alone in that apartment, to whatever remained of my brother in whatever space the dead occupy, I know you might not understand this. I know you might have wanted me to let it go, but I am not doing this for me anymore, Kofi. I am doing this so he has to carry you. So he has to wake up every day and know your name. So you are not forgotten by the man who forgot you. That's all. That's all I need. I wiped my face. I stood up. I made tea. And I went back to work. Through Mrs. O, a woman in Park Jae-won's circle who had a conscience and an unfortunate habit of sharing everything with him, I received an invitation. A private dinner. Park Jae-won's home in Hanam-dong. Framed as a gesture of goodwill from a man who felt personal obligation toward a woman harmed near his properties. He still did not know who I was. He just knew an innocent woman had been hurt, and that this made him feel something unfamiliar. I accepted with a smile I had practiced for 12 years. His house was everything I expected. Hanam-dong. floor-to-ceiling windows over the Han River, Korean art on the walls, a dining table set for two. A man who stood when I entered, a reflex of courtesy that surprised me, and who looked, up close, older than his photographs. More lines, more weight, the face of a man carrying decades of decisions. He shook my hand. He said he was glad I had survived, and something in his voice genuinely beneath the polish told me he meant it. I sat across from the man who killed my brother. I touched the bracelet beneath my sleeve, and I smiled. Over 2 hours, I gave him exactly what he needed to believe. I told him about losing my brother years ago. I watched his face when I said it. Nothing. Not even a flicker. Kofi was still just a forgotten Tuesday to him. I pressed my thumbnail into my palm under the table so that I would feel something physical instead of what I was actually feeling. It helped. Barely. I told him I believed people could change. That no matter what someone had done, there was always a chance for redemption, for a reckoning with the truth of who they had been. I said this looking directly at him, and Park Jae-won looked back at me with something raw moving behind his eyes. He said quietly that he hoped I was right. He had no idea I was not offering him hope. I was offering him a mirror. That dinner was the beginning of 3 months. Gallery openings, foundation dinners, lunches near his office. He introduced me to people in his circle as a remarkable young woman. He had claimed my story as evidence of something he needed to believe about himself. I was his good deed, his proof that the universe still owed him something other than consequences. I was also the person who knew him better than anyone in his life, and who he knew least of all. Every conversation I added a layer. Every meeting I noted what moved him. I introduced guilt into our discussions obliquely, through philosophy, through hypotheticals, through the kind of conversations that feel abstract until suddenly they do not. I asked him once whether he believed a person could be fully aware of all the harm they had caused. He was quiet. Then he said, "I think the honest answer is that most people don't let themselves know." "And what would it take," I said, "for someone like that to finally face it?" He said, "Something they cannot ignore." I nodded slowly, and I thought, yes, something exactly like me. The hard part of those 3 months was not the performance. I had been performing for 12 years. The hard part was the moments between performances. The drive home after a dinner with him. The walk back to Mapo-gu. The moments when the mask came off and I was just Amara again, tired, grieving, wearing a dead man's bracelet and carrying a Tuesday phone call I could never return. On those walks, I sometimes talked to Kofi under my breath, just quietly. "I'm close," I would say. "Almost there. I haven't forgotten you. I could never forget you. Not for a single day. Not once." The city moved around me. Nobody heard. He heard. I have to believe he heard. 8 weeks into my access to Park Jae-won, Junho met him. It appeared accidental. Junho came to meet me near a Gangnam building where I had been visiting. Park Jae-won was leaving as Junho arrived. They passed each other in the lobby, and Park Jae-won froze. I was 20 feet away. I watched his face. I saw something happen behind his eyes that none of our dinners or conversations had produced. Not recognition of Junho's face, but recognition of something in it. Some echo. Something his memory had buried years ago beginning to surface. Later, he asked me who the young man was. I told him Junho's first name. I told him he was a friend. And then carefully, precisely, I told him that Junho had lost a parent years ago. Tragically, in circumstances that had never been explained to him. Park Jae-won went very still. "What was his mother's name?" he asked. I told him, and I watched Park Jae-won remember. Not Kofi. Not yet. But another order. Another Tuesday. Another loose end he had not thought about in years and now could not stop thinking about because it was standing in a lobby with a face that carried his mother's grief in its bones. He excused himself. His composure was fracturing. Invisibly to most, but I was not most. I drove home that evening and I sat in my car outside my building for 40 minutes. Not celebrating. Not feeling triumph. Just sitting with the strange, aching weight of watching a man begin to feel for the first time what he had made other people feel for decades. There is something in that that is not satisfaction. I don't have a word for what it is. It is something older and sadder than satisfaction. The weight was building on him, and I had not even shown him the heaviest thing yet. The night before, the last dinner, the night before everything, I sat alone in my apartment. Kofi's photograph on the table in front of me, the same one I would place between us tomorrow. Him at 23, laughing, whole, before any of this. And something came undone in me. I want to be honest with you. I promised you honesty from the beginning, and I am going to keep that promise even here, especially here. I broke. Not quietly, not gracefully, not the way I had cried in the hospital, controlled, private, manageable. I broke the way you break, when 12 years of holding yourself together finally exceeds what any human being can hold. I put my face in my hands and I wept in a way I had not wept since I was 17 years old on that floor. I cried for Kofi. For every year without him, for every laugh I didn't hear, and every phone call I missed, and every book he didn't get to read, and every morning he didn't get to wake up to. I cried for the Tuesday I didn't talk to him. For you don't sound fine, Amara, and my stupid, stubborn I'm fine when I was not fine. When I was never fine. When I should have just talked to him. Just kept him on the phone. Just given him one more minute of me. I cried for what I had become. For the 12 years of walls and ceilings and strategic friendships and lonely apartments and whispered conversations with a dead man's bracelet. For the version of myself that might have existed if none of this had happened, some other Amara somewhere who had kept her brother and kept her lightness and never had to become this. I cried for Junho, for what I had used him for even while genuinely caring about him, for the guilt that had no clean resolution. I cried until there was nothing left. Until I was completely empty, wrung out. Just a woman on a floor, the same position I had been in 12 years ago, on a different floor in a different city, with a photograph and a bracelet, and the absolute devastating knowledge that tomorrow I was going to finish this, and it was not going to bring him back. It was never going to bring him back. I don't know how long I was on that floor. Eventually, I got up. I washed my face. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long time. I looked at the bracelet, and I heard him. Not literally, not a voice from somewhere, just in the way that the people we have lost live inside us if we loved them well enough. I heard Kofi, his particular economy of words, 3 words, the way he always spoke when something mattered most. I see you. That was enough. I picked up the photograph. I put it in my bag. I went to bed. In the morning I got dressed, and I went to end it. His dining room. Sunday evening, tea on the table, the Han River glittering through the floor to ceiling windows below. We had eaten. We sat in the kind of silence that had become, over 3 months, almost comfortable. He trusted me, genuinely. I could see it in the way he sat, no performance, no armor, just a man having tea with a woman he believed had every reason to hate the world and had chosen grace instead. He had no idea grace was not what I had chosen. I reached into my bag. I placed the photograph on the table between us. Kofi, 23, laughing. Park Jae-won looked at it. And I watched the recognition come slower than with Junho's mother. Because Kofi was older in this photograph, because more years had passed, because the memory was buried deeper. But it came. It always comes. He looked up at me. I held his gaze and I said quietly, without trembling, though every part of me wanted to tremble. His name was Kofi. He was 23 years old. He was my brother. He was in Jae-won on a Wednesday night in October, and he saw something he was never meant to see. And you gave an order, and he never came home. And I have been wearing his bracelet every day for 12 years, waiting to sit across from you and say his name to your face. The silence in that room was complete. Park Jae-won did not look away, did not deny. Something in him, something that had been cracking for months under the weight of Junho's mother and 3 bullet wounds and dinners full of careful philosophy, finally gave way entirely. You knew, he said. This whole time. Yes, the shooting was me. Every part of it. Silence. Why? He asked. And his voice, the voice that had given orders for 30 years without a tremor, was barely a sound. And I told him the truth. Not the strategic truth, the real one. I told him, because you forgot him. Because my brother was a whole entire world and you reduced him to a Tuesday and forgot him before the week was out. I did not need you dead. I needed you to remember. I needed Kofi to be impossible to forget for the rest of your life. I reached into my bag one final time. His security was not in the room. 3 months of being perceived as harmless had seen to that. I placed the gun on the table. Not raised, not pointed. Just placed it there like the final piece of evidence in a case that had taken 12 years to build. Park Jae-won looked at it, looked at me, and did something I had not anticipated. He didn't call for help. He sat back, slowly, and he looked at me with the eyes of a man who had perhaps always known somewhere very deep and very quiet that something like this was coming. That 30 years of orders and forgotten names could not accumulate forever without a reckoning. That consequence, when it finally arrived, would not look the way he imagined. It would look like a woman with her brother's bracelet on her wrist. "You're going to kill me," he said. I picked up the gun. "No," I said, and I shot him. Twice. Precise. Calculated as everything had always been calculated. Not the heart. The spine. Not to end his life. To end his power. To give him a body that would not obey him for the rest of his days. A wheelchair. Dependency. The man who had made everyone else's bodies the currency of his power, now requiring others for every basic function of existence. Not death. Memory. Permanent. Inescapable. Every morning waking up and knowing why. He went down. I stood over him. His eyes were open, shocked in pain, and beneath all of it something I had not expected. Something that looked almost like relief. I crouched down beside him, close, and I said my brother's name one final time. "Kofi," I said. "Say his name." Park Jae-won, broken, bleeding, the most powerful man in the wrong circles of Seoul, closed his eyes. And he said it. Kofi. Just that. Barely a whisper. But it was the only word in 12 years that mattered. I stood up. I made the anonymous call. I walked out into the Seoul night. I did not run. I never run. Park Jae-won survived, as I knew he would. He will spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. He will wake up every morning in a body that no longer obeys him, and he will think about the names, Kofi, Junho's mother, all the orders, all the Tuesdays he has spent 30 years not thinking about. He will think about a woman with a braided leather bracelet on her wrist who sat across from him for 3 months and smiled. I left Seoul that night, a bag packed, a plan for after, because there is always a plan for after when you have been planning for 12 years. Junho called weeks later. I listened to the voicemail without answering. He said he had heard about Park Jae-won. He said he didn't know what to think. He said he hoped I was okay. And then quietly, at the end, he said, "Whatever you did, I think you did it for both of us. And I think my mother would understand." I played that voicemail 4 times. I cried on the 3rd. I deleted it on the 4th. I think about Kofi every day. I think about his laugh. I think about coconut oil and old books and the way he called me his shadow like it was the kindest thing in the world. I think about Tuesday, about "You don't sound fine, Amara, talk to me." I talk to him still, wherever I am now. Whatever city, whatever window, whatever rainy night, I talk to him. I tell him what I did and why. I ask if he understands. I don't always get an answer. But sometimes, in the particular quiet that comes after a storm, in the way light sometimes hits a room in the late afternoon, I feel something that is not quite peace but is in the same neighborhood as it. I still wear the bracelet. I will wear it until I don't. Somewhere in Seoul tonight, a man is sitting in a wheelchair in a darkened room above the Han River. And he is saying a name. Not because he wants to, because he cannot stop. That is not everything, but it is something. And after 12 years of nothing, something is the whole world. That is my story. That is Kofi's story. That is what love looks like when it has nowhere left to go but forward.